welcome everyone here and on Zoom for joining us for this special event. I'm Stephen Henry Madoff, the chair of the MA Curatorial Practice program here at the School of Visual Arts in New York. It's truly an honor to welcome our guest speaker, Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev, for the Distinguished Global Curator Lecture series. And let me introduce Carolyn with a quote from her writing for her 2012 dOCUMENTA 13. Quote, "When an artwork is looked at closely, it becomes, as in meditation, an ever more abstract exercise, a thinking and imagining while thinking, until the phenomenology of that viscous experience allows the mind to merge with matter and slowly, possibly, to see the world not from the point of view of the discerning subject, the detached subject, but from within so-called objects and outward," end quote. This special inverse kind of thinking, so characteristic of Carolyn's brilliance, allows us to reimagine not only what it means to perceive art and also the worlds in which it exists, but also the act of exhibition making, for which Carolyn has shown the world over and over again in her practice what exhibition making as a phenomenal event, an inquiry into the now, as she puts it, can be. Carolyn is the former director of the Castello di Rivoli Museum of Contemporary Art, the organizer, as I've just mentioned, of dOCUMENTA 13, an artistic director of the Sydney and Istanbul biennials, and the exhibition maker of more shows than I can name here, without taking time away from her to present her thoughts about angels and engineers, about the pressing issues of artistic freedom in settings of the utopian and dystopian, our strange musics today and to come. At this moment in our own society, when I think of angels, I don't think of angelology or Rilke's Duino elegies with his angelic orders, or even, as Carolyn references, Paul Klee and Walter Benjamin. I think of Abraham Lincoln speaking in his first inaugural address about our civic ethical responsibilities when he invoked, quote, "the better angels of our nature." And with that, again, it's a great honor to have Carolyn with us. Welcome, Carolyn.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you, Stephen, for that quote. It threw me back into a moment when I was thinking that way and writing that text. So thank you very much. It was unexpected. And thank you all for being here, and the school and the students for having me. So I have 110 pages to read, but I don't think we can actually do that. So I've slashed some pages as I sat waiting between the class this afternoon and now. And as you can see, this talk is a version, a modified version of a lecture in Dresden, which is a city that was totally razed to the ground during World War II. And that was after a lecture in Copenhagen the year prior. So it's a very long process. And since I am at the SVA curatorial course, I think I'm going to deliver something which is not fully thought out and not a ready-to-print essay. It's more showing you, especially the students who want to further this field, how the process of thinking towards an exhibition happens. So it may take years, and it sometimes becomes an exhibition and sometimes it doesn't. But there's incredible magic that happens when it does become still as open as a thinking process, but an embodied thinking process. So the series of previous talks that I've given have been about and thinking about initially only artistic freedom. And it was sparked by the polemics around the last dOCUMENTA, 15 in Castello. But before I'd like to enter into the subject, I think it's good to speak at least a few words with more or less the same meanings in mind, which is something very difficult today in our dramatically dismembered and divided era. So for those of us, and I see so many young people here, so I don't think there are many, but for those of us who were reading and thinking in the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the image of Klee, Paul Klee's Angelus Novus, a 1920 work, unique work, an ancestor to what today we kind of call meme, as it traveled from being interpreted by Walter Benjamin in his last 1944 text on history, shortly before committing suicide, to thousands of further pages and comments by other philosophers and thinkers worldwide. It really has what you call today a mimetic energy. Always an angel of history, unable to stop the winds of progress, rushing towards catastrophe. That's the core of Benjamin's argument, which was then followed by everybody, thousands of pages. And it is for this talk, not necessarily the angel of history, but what Klee called it, the Angelus Novus, the new angel. Perhaps when he made it in 1920, 2 years after the war, an image of the angel of freedom, but also a self-portrait. So the artist as the angel of freedom. Now here it says, go to page 16, which I'm going to do. 16. Ah, yes, it's just a little bit of story about this object. It's a very small object. It was exhibited the first time in Munich in 1920. And Benjamin was visiting, no, actually it was exhibited in Vienna, I'm sorry. And Walter Benjamin and Gershom Scholem, who were friends, went to the gallery to see this first retrospective of Paul Klee in a private gallery, and it was acquired, I believe, as a present, a birthday present to Klee, because it was Klee's birthday that day. And Benjamin didn't have, no, I'm sorry, I keep mixing names up. That happens when you get near 16. It was the birthday of Benjamin, and they were in the gallery, and I think Gershom Scholem bought it as a gift to give him, although there's no proof. But Benjamin didn't have much money. It was the birthday. And then later Gershom Scholem wrote a poem about this, this painting, or this Angelus Novus, that Benjamin quotes just before his fourth thesis on history. And the poem recites, "My wing is ready to fly. I would rather turn back, for had I stayed living time, I would have had little luck." Angelic Greetings by Gershom Scholem. What Benjamin did was take it with him back to Berlin. It was small, and he also took it with him wherever he went. So he would pull it out and travel with it like a kind of amulet or an enchanted object, certainly an auratic object. And when he left for escaping Europe, he entrusted it to Georges Bataille, who was running the library in Paris. And Bataille kept it for him, and he said it should have gone to Adorno. And so Adorno was already in California, had already left Germany. And indeed, after the death of Benjamin and the war, it does go to Adorno in California. And after the death of Adorno, the widow gives it to Gershom Scholem, and it goes to Jerusalem. And when he dies, it goes to the museum where it now is. I think it was like the restitution of a gift, in a way, something that they all knew had been this gift. And as you may know, the New York-based artist Rebecca Quitman did a project in Jerusalem around this little small painting. But what is interesting to point out is that Benjamin is the same Benjamin that wrote about the obsolescence, the lack of aura in the artwork at the time of the mechanical reproduction of the artwork in the time of photography. And in many ways, what Klee did, or what Benjamin did with this object, is treated as a highly auratic object. But I think he was exploring and didn't write this anywhere, but I believe that he was exploring the relationship between art and technology and how there are modes of, let's say, humanization of technology throughout history since the birth of the first technique, which maybe is a stone or fire. And this humanization, or at least the transactions and what artists do to negotiate those relationships with the tool or the technique in general, the craft with the tool, is something that Benjamin was trying to work out and didn't write, but I believe it has to do with Klee's ability to invent, or to, maybe not the only one, but one of the few, or at least to theorize or to practice, not theorize at all, the idea of the uniqueness within the reproduction of the mechanical reproduction of signs. And in fact, the monoprint, as you know, is one print, is the matrix of the print is destroyed in the process of making it and inking. And so you have a mechanical aspect of the drawing, and then you have also additions with hand painting and so on, of watercolor sometimes, in this case, yes. But even without those hand additions by Klee, you have basically Klee taking a strategy which is different from that of Duchamp. It's not suspending the object of serial reproduction in modern industry and putting it on a pedestal like a suspension out of that machinic time, but it is actually creating this breakage of the idea of the serial reproduction of a print, of an etching, let's say, with the monoprint. So it is a bit of a machine, and it is an angel. And it is 2 years after the end of World War I, which saw for the first time demons, fallen angels from the sky, bombing places for the first time. So we're in a world of references and indirect messages going on, and messages are the stuff of angels. So when I speak tonight about art, I'm not going to use the word as in a broad sense, like the arts, as a synonym of all cultural practice made by humans, including literature, painting, sculpture, dance, installation, film, photography, or the classics would say dance and architecture, the major art of the arts in the plural, film, etc. Nor am I going to use it, as I did in dOCUMENTA 13, as an expanded version of human culture, including science and many other cultural productions also of non-humans, bees, beehives, bowerbirds, nests, and mushrooms, and so on, as I did at the time. I'm going to instead return to a very old-fashioned and obsolete idea of art as it developed in so-called Western culture with modern individualism since the 1300s, and especially since the 1700s, with the notion of creative genius and the birth of modern aesthetics. That is, as the fruit of an autonomous artistic practice by an individual called an artist that produces artworks for him or herself first and foremost, and for others too, for contemplation and reflection, and where the means, materials, techniques, forms, and contents all coincide. This is a very traditional definition. But being European and Italian at that, partly Italian, half Italian, it's my situated world. So our indigeneity is Vasari. It's the Colosseum. So that is our world. So I can speak from that voice without, hopefully without creating misunderstandings. And that particular idea of artist, let's say the beginnings are really in the late 1300s in Siena and so on, but the first signatures are mainly in the 1500s, and then it gets identified during the bourgeois modernity more clearly with Winkelmann and Kant and so on. This particular notion of the artist is quite entangled with an idea of artistic freedom. To be able to make artworks that are not applied art, that are not design or architecture, and that are rather a form of empirical philosophy created by any means, a sort of verification of our being alive and human, no matter what technology can reproduce or produce. And these artists, from my history, legacy, have always painted angels, a lot of angels, and have accessed angels, the messengers between the divine and the human spheres, transcendence and immanence. As mediators, angels are similar to the artists, actually. But evermore, it seems today that their function as engineers of the divine-human relations become more and more evident. So what does it mean to live under a canopy of thousands of partially interconnected engineered satellites circulating above us? Freedom seems to have become an outdated word that was used to describe formerly a feeling of non-oppression, of movement, of choice, of potentiality to act, of self-determination. But freedom is a word that has been used less and less because identified either as unspeakable insofar as related to emancipation of unfree peoples, and therefore speakable not by privileged voices, or co-opted by certain areas around liberal liberalist economies and the freedoms of investments and so forth. So, and this freedom, that, let's call it Enlightenment idea of freedom, is quite not functioning now in the technological age of predictive statistics. So algorithms are fundamentally predictive statistics based on engineering attention towards personalized choices through our phones. And this has been developed since about 2013. I say this because that's a watershed year. Prior to that, when I did the documenta, there was not yet these systems of predictive statistics on the basis of your choices as data sets, which would have determined a very different documenta had I understood and been aware of that at the time. And freedom of expression today, which was fundamental to that, let's say, European project, is not freedom in an era of mass narcissism that relentlessly requires us all to produce creative and expressive, tangible and intangible goods. So, in experimental subjects, this artistic freedom as the angel of history, an intellectual, imaginative, and tender horizon that produces online and offline singular and collective consciousness can be reimagined, I believe. But let us start with the counter argument. The engineer, if it can happen, if we think about the artist and the artist, the angel, and the engineer in a new reading of subjectivization, of subject formation. But before, let us start with a counter argument. The engineer as a techno-libertarian figure at the service of an elite, which would be what you may be thinking all through my talk. And so we might as well get through it right at the beginning. And therefore, if we think about this figure, we can see that it emerges in the early 2000s. And techno-libertarianism, now it's on blue, I don't know why, but that means that I can't read it as well. Techno-libertarianism, as you know, is a blend of technological optimism and libertarian political philosophy. And amongst their core beliefs, and I'm thinking of Peter Thiel and a certain number of other figures, is that technology is itself ontologically a liberatory force. They believe technology, especially digital and decentralized technologies, can empower individuals, undermine centralized authority, and increase personal freedom. Like classical libertarians, techno-libertarians advocate for minimal state intervention in the economy and in personal lives, including opposition to regulation of tech companies or online content. They see free market as the most efficient engine for innovation and technological progress. They tend to distrust government bureaucracy and traditional 2 out of 110 institutions, seeing them as obstacles to progress and freedom. Thiel is often associated with techno-libertarianism, but he's a particularly extreme case of that. And again, we're speaking really not about today, except in its effects, but we're speaking about ideas that were circulating in the early 2000s, around 2009, 2010, of which I wasn't aware in those years. So he, of course, champions decentralized financial transactions, and has funded projects like the Seasteading Institute. But fundamentally, he became skeptical of democracy, of its compatibility with freedom and innovation. And he famously said in 2009, "I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible." His politics are authoritarian, and he supports strong centralized leadership, less in line with classic libertarian beliefs, which were anti-statalist. I don't know how you say that. So he believes that democracy in its modern mass form requires redistribution and a compromise in this process of redistribution, indeed, which inevitably, according to him, curtails individual freedoms, particularly the economic freedom. And democratic societies demand or need or require welfare states and regulations to appease and to further the common good of the majority. So they tend, in his view, to inhibit risk-taking innovations. So he sees a contradiction between individualism and egalitarianism, which were, however, at the core of the Enlightenment project, the unfinished Enlightenment project, no matter how hypocritical we think it may be, given that it was applied only to the citoyen in Europe. So fundamentally, this perspective is looking at forms of homo deus, you know, the book, and able to lead this progress towards forms of subservient humanity. And it has been at the core of so many dystopic films and books and sci-fi books over the last 10 years. And I believe this is also why it has strangely encouraged and brought a schism, a separation between the technological world and AI artists, or what they're called that way, but artists who have worked together and danced together with machines since, let's say, the 1600s, like Kircher, Anastasius Kircher machines, or pianos that played and turned into colors, different colors, and so forth. So this has a long history. It's way before plugging in was necessary and way before the computer. But there has been, which was not true at the time of Bernini. Bernini was an engineer, by the way. He was the best engineer. And he's a great sculptor and architect, but his ability to design, to engineer water and the way that water will function in relation to stone is why he won the competition to do, for example, the river of the sculpture of the four rivers in Piazza Navona in Rome. It was his engineering capacities that got him that commission, artist commission. But those ideas of techno-libertarianism brought to those extremes tended to create, I think, a schism, a cleavage, a breakage between, let's call it the traditional art world, or the art world, the one that most of you are part of, suspicious of digital artists who are seen still today, or even more so today, as mainly expressions of positions that do not contain forms of ethics or empathy. And so the message of Klee, however, which we discussed, you know, the relationship with the machinic of Klee's monoprint, the angel of history, the angel, the angelus novus, the artistic angel is a machine as well. If one follows the lines and the way that it's constructed, it is a device. Now that message of click, one can receive it or not. In this message is about our capacity to re-engineer, to become the subject, the engineering subject. And that is a message that, for example, Andy Warhol quite well understood, because, of course, you have the silkscreen repetition, serial repetition of the image of Marilyn or of Campbell soup or whatever that was mass produced, but the silk screens, the different colors are never matched up right. And then he often put a little bit of paint on it as well. So Warhol truly continued the project, let's say, of Paul Klee. We said that there are, so what I'm interested in exploring, which is how a curatorial mind works, is the dialectic between technology and theory of subjectivity. And it was very useful to read Agamben's work in 2009, written Angeli, Ebraismo, Cristianesimo, and Islam. So angels within the religions of the book, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Where going back to the root, which he wrote together with a younger philosopher called Emanuele Coccia, who also just came out, I don't think it's translated yet into English, with Hiérarchie, la Société des Anges, Hierarchies, the Society of Angels. It's a 2023 book published in French, strangely, not in Italian, but then it got translated into Italian afterwards. Anyway, this allowed me to think about the history of subject formation and how it's entangled with the history of technology and of art. And they look back, of course, to the main source for studying angels and angelology, which is Pseudo Dionisio, the Areopagite, which was a 5th century so early Christian writer who wrote down all this hierarchy. Hierarchy means the house, basically, of the angels. And so when we use the word hierarchy, we're actually talking about, that's why it has the same root of is in the word hieratico, hieratic, something that's hieratic and so on. So the hierarchies that Pseudo Dionysius, why he's called Pseudo Dionysius is interesting. It's because Dionysus, and if we think about the angels, all civilizations, all cultures worldwide, no part in the world, to my knowledge, doesn't have messengers or mediators between some sort of divine and transcendent world and the world that we live in. Whether it's the elders that are embedded within the landscape and the songlines in Australia, or it's the ancient gods of the Mediterranean. The gods themselves were the angels. In Mediterranean culture, in Greek, in our ancestors, they were the angels. So the gods sometimes come down to earth, and they even have babies with people. And so we have nymphs that are the child of Zeus and someone. And therefore they are the ancestors of what in Judaism and Christianity and so forth become, and especially in Christianity, the angels are very much descendants of the figure of Dionysus. So Dionysus was this god of transformation, metamorphosis, the ability to escape the rational thinking and to enter into mystical connection with the cosmos. And the Dionysian mask is very important in changing into the many different angelic figures that we later have. But basically what I'm describing or trying to describe with the 9 tiers of angels and so on is that sometimes you would become an angel, like a person would die and become an angel. And in this vision, let's say medieval vision. But sometimes the angel falls, can become a demon, and the fallen angel is an angel also. And so why this happens, in my view, is because it's a hydraulic system. It's kind of like a fountain. So it's an engineered system, because otherwise there would be like overpopulation of angels up in the sky, too many. So there's a whole system which is tremendously designed in the mode through which an engineer would do that. But the question of the artistic freedom and the artist as an angel is that what I am thinking about and arguing is that subject formation and subjectivity has something to do now with engineering oneself, and therefore not only being engineered by, but engineering oneself. And this we see in so many different ways, in the ways that people try to control or limit the time that they're spending on the screen, do yoga, or spend an hour taking the dog out, or bicycle. How many hours a day for sleeping, for eating, for studying at school, for reading a paper book, not just reading online. All of these are techniques of self-engineering, which need to be looked at if we want to build, again, a theory of subject formation, and not simply remain where we were with that, which is liquidating it. I mean, what we did was intellectually liquidate the idea of the self, of the subject. I did it too. You know, it's part of feminism, feminist trajectory to move. When Lucy Irigaray moves from the I to the we, to the nous, it's part of it. And in let's say more patriarchal, well, not patriarchal, more from a methodology, more, let's say, sociological and philosophical methodologies, it was liquidated by the School of Frankfurt. I mean, the dialectic of the Enlightenment begins it, and then we go into the Foucauldian mode of the subject being, or Althusser before even, saying, who is the self, who is the subject? You become a subject when another looks at you and says, hey, you. And you're shocked by being called. And this call by the other begins our constitution of subjectivity as, therefore, somehow not attacked, but a subject that must stand in front of an authority or a form of power. So for Foucault, this becomes the subject has critical consciousness and is able to resist the constructions of power that we are subjected to. So this, let's say, narrates the whole second half of the 20th century in European thought, and has been widely exported worldwide, but I believe belongs to a particular era, let's say, of the history of humanity. So how can we return to the question of subject formation, not as a philosophical relic, but as a living process after this historical detachment in contemporary discourse, due to that let's say, nefarious entanglement with the idea of the Western European autonomous subject that appeared, let's say, more or less during the Renaissance. It didn't exist in the Middle Ages or in antiquity. So it is not an ontological, genetic, biological thing of Europe. It appears as a construction at a particular moment of our history, which is at the close of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance. And that subject, we've just discussed it, so I don't have to read that. But how can we also not do this operation, not perform this operation by denying what Judith Butler or so many thinkers have done, but rolling it up, rolling it in within, as we can roll all the notions of subjectivity that have emerged throughout the ages. Because these theories that humans give to understand themselves, they're never wrong totally. They're just of that time. So if we want to think about figures that can constitute images of ideal subjectivity, ideal subjects, we could say that Renaissance subject was a geographer and a subject that needed, for the organization of the society, I'm talking about European culture, needed the constitution of the nation state and the hierarchical structure of monarchy. So monarchy was invented actually in Florence. It was the Tuscan state, the way the Medici did it, and that was copied by François Ier and then Carlo V, and so the nation states of France and Spain. I'm not talking about 19th century, that's another story, and that is in art nothing different than Renaissance perspective. So when you define a space with a punto di fuga, focal point, it is constructing a pyramid structure, and the viewer is symmetrical to that. And this is an artistic, let's say, imagination or an artistic representation of that notion of subjectivity to which people would somehow aspire to, as at that time, emancipatory from feudalism, because it was a slave society, the feudal society prior to that. So, so how can we think about this moment that we're living in, which is a machinic moment, where this critical undoing, which characterized the 20th century thought. Well, I skipped a few. I mean, there's like the 1600s, the model is the thinker. So, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, said Descartes, and that was in a moment where subjectivity is constituted as being able to think. And of course, that makes no sense nowadays with AI. I mean, it makes no sense as an ideal, the ideal of an autonomous thinking. It doesn't make sense. So it is not something to which on a subconscious level or on a personal level we particularly aspire to. So what I'm trying to think about is, and who is the we? The we is the me. So I'm talking about me. And let's say, I'm not making a universal theory here at all. Not at all. Not at all. So when after 2013, there was this subtle seismic shift that occurred, the algorithmic infrastructure seeped into the weave of our everyday life, and suddenly the fallen subject was not just the fallen Western subject. In a reconsideration of an expanded view, of a post-colonial, more global subjectivity emerging. It was also the beginning of a collapse of the notion of a human subject as having agency within that same West, because of the artificial intelligences that mirror and mimic and surpass it. Oh, by the way, the subject in the 20th century, I was thinking, what was the subject? It is my passport photo. So it's the era of the photograph. So we are nothing. You know, a 20th century person is a disaster that has to aspire to look like a passport photo. I am what I own, which may be very little, and I am that person on the passport. It's really me. That was this, let's say, detached, self-referential, and divested of interiority subject, a kind of screen. And it is not by chance the century of cinema and of the rise of the image. So I think Bracha Ettinger, I was showing you a painting. This is just a painting, also inspired by Klee's Angelus Novus, by Bracha Ettinger, who is a theoretician of the matrixial since the late 70s and 80s, and particularly topical, I think, today in the history of feminism, because she is working towards an idea of subject which is co-emerging with the other, but which is an I. So there is a theory of an I as emerging out of this the not yet child and the not yet mother, let's say, that we can think about as within the womb, so before birth. And this matrixial emerging subject is very, very interesting in her writings in terms of how we can find forms of humanism, let's say, again. So this is called the angel of Cariance. And so what I'd like to ask is whether engineering per se, just the fact of engineering, is the problem. I don't think engineering is the problem that we have. It's its use. It's the instrumentalization of engineering that can deaden thought or not. And just as reason per se is not bad, reason per se is not bad. It's the use to which a reason was put, like that can either transform it into a tool of domination and transform people into things, or it is not. So when the philosophers in the Second World War wrote about the engineering of death and modernity as ontologically bad because the engineering of the train system in Germany brought people in an engineered way to Auschwitz that was engineered death. This is not necessarily because of the nature, the intrinsic nature of engineering. And so we would have to start asking ourselves, what is engineering then? And engineering is a very interesting practice. First of all, etymologically, it comes from ingenio, and ingenio doesn't mean to make machines or to make arms. Ingenio means creativity, it means desire, it means many different things, the ability to be really good at something that you really like. And so this word became the genio. First, it was indeed applied towards military things. The word genio was used to speak about the people who would make cannonball throwers in the 1500s. And then, so it was a military field. Then, and by the way, one of the greatest engineers was Leonardo da Vinci, also great engineer. But then it became the civil engineering, when you had to build bridges and roads and things like this. So we're in the 1800s. And then it becomes the computer engineering and so on in the much more recent times. So what we can see is it is like the field of the architect prior, l'architetto, the architect, but taking away the question of humans need to like it. So the architect is also invested in aesthetics, and people need to like the house that they're going to be living in or something. But if you strip the architect of that aesthetic goal of pleasing to the senses of the humans, then what's left is the engineer, actually. So it's someone able to transform materials and into numbers, transform materials into numbers, and then compute, and then retransform those numbers into materials. And so you build the bridge and it doesn't fall. But without any consideration for the question of whether it's beautiful or not. That's somebody else's question. But isn't this a marvelous world to be in, the world where the numbers, what are numbers? I mean, numbers are something unbelievable. I'm going to get lost here on page 6 out of 110, but numbers are something unbelievable. We used to think that numbers were abstract, like they're an abstraction from reality, 1, 2, 3 eggs and 1, 2, 3. And now we know with the place we are at that numbers have substance, because if you are considering on a subatomic level, and you're considering, for example, what they call now quantum computers, which really aren't functioning yet. They don't function because they have so few qubits, they can't function. But sooner or later, at some point, but in any case, even just sophisticated traditional computers, we are talking about so small, so many numbers, because numbers are characterized also by growth. They grow, which is something amazing. Mario Merz loved numbers. Let's put some arte povera up. Well, I was supposed to show you this, Guernica, when we were talking about the artist as the angel of freedom. So Guernica is something that everyone thinks about when thinking about that. But in the 20th century, also Jackson Pollock, after the war, you have to look at his drippings. This is very few years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So a kind of pulverization of the world, and negotiating that culturally as a form of radical individuality of the dripping, and radical idea of freedom in that. These are a little bit cliches of what is artistic freedom, but, and arte povera you may know less, just as radical a gesture of artistic freedom was Cunelis's, not a performance, exhibition of the 12 horses at the Galleria Lattico. This is, I was going to explain all of these radical moments of the idea of artistic freedom in the 20th century. For example, the artist who does his exhibition in his own studio, and in the gallery, there's just a sign that says, the show is on, but it's not here in the gallery, it's at my studio, please come by. And other actions that had to do with an idea of radical freedom. Calzolari and his Annunciation is something that I will come back to. And I wanted you to see the Casa Ideale, the first time ice, frozen humidity into ice is used as an artistic material, as a form of radical artistic freedom, again in the late 60s in Arte Povera. And the relationship with the angel and the angelic in the work of Calzolari is very deep. Or Giovanni Anselmo, another Arte Povera artist whose radical gesture of artistic freedom was to run towards the sunset and take a picture of the sunset every 10 meters as he was running. And it's called an interference into the universal gravitation, because basically if you run towards the sunset somehow you're delaying the sunset on a very, very small scale. Again, you're somehow gaining a little bit of more light because you're walking counter to the rotation of the earth. And so this is one of the most beautiful images of the wish for artistic freedom, in this case, against even the machine that is produced by the harmony of the spheres or the unharmony of the spheres, the planets themselves and how they work. And Alighiero Boetti's Ordine and Disordine, order and disorder, which is an ancestor, I think, to the most interesting digital art today. So Boetti was constantly engineering rules and games and systems that other people would participate in, creating community by doing that. And whether it was using a ballpoint pen to make a monochrome or coloring the little faces of people or squaring words, what he called squaring words like ordine and disordine. It's trying to join the systemic and the engineered with the human gestures. Okay, this has nothing to do with, that was just me. And that's also nothing to do with this. So let's just go ahead. That was Entactische Kunst, limiting artistic freedom. There was a whole part about censorship. Oh, we're not going to talk about censorship, but I found very interesting the censorship of Pasolini. So the lack of artistic freedom in Italy in the 70s, you know, one of the many films that were censored, and the censoring on Instagram of Mike Winkelmann's FTX boardroom, which was an everyday that he made, referring to a man in the crypto world who basically cheated. By the way, the concept of cheating is a very interesting concept that coming from gaming. But in gaming, cheating is almost a quality if you get away with it. And in the actual engineering world, it's the worst thing you can do, because if you cheat, the bridge falls or the whole system goes down. So the way that ethics are being transformed today are part of this subjectivizing, a new subjectivity of what I kind of call the engineer subject, but I think the artist engineer, the angel engineer, is where we've got to go. I mean, we've got to get to that direction. This is all about censorship. Ah, a nice angel. Okay, so I was telling you that numbers have a substance today, which means that they actually take up time and space. And when you get into a quantum thinking, you're obviously thinking about things that are both energy and matter, and can be one or the other, or can be both actually at the same time in a state of superposition. And when we then get to what we consider the most abstract thing, like a number, it actually takes up space. You know, it takes salt for our synapses to work, kind of salt in there, or there's no jump, electrical jump, and and therefore, and in the computers, it takes energy for them to run, you know, lots of computational work to be done, and therefore a lot of energy. So we cannot continue now to think of numbers as something abstract. And very interestingly, if we go backwards, again in my knowledges, which are situated, the numbers in relation to the gods, and in relation to the hierarchies and structuring of angels are something particularly interesting in relation to what we call algorithms today. So the numbers of the gods and the algorithms of the humans and how they relate. So we think, however, that this engineer who translates materials into numbers in order to calculate statics or other capacities of those materials and how they function in systems, we think of that as a subject that tends to lack empathy. as what counts for the engineer is the performativity and a sort of achievement of goals. And that technical human engineer is not contextualized in an Umwelt, but is somehow merged within the technical. This reminds me of issues around autism. So I began to think about the autistic personalities, which are not normative, and that on the one hand can be very capacious, as we know, in maths, but sometimes have difficulty in dialoguing with the outside world, not because they don't have perceptions, but because they have too many perceptions. So in order to not be in a total chaos, there's often a form of masking that occurs in order to somehow fit in with others who are not autistic, and to also very strong perceptive abilities to be able to construct those masks of this hyper autonomous and very fragile as well subject. Like a machine, the autistic doesn't seem to suffer, but that is absolutely not the case if one understands how selfhood is constructed within the autistic. And so I started to think about the engineer, the genius, the high IQ, the autistic, and at a certain point, I decided, I'm skipping the part about freedom, defining freedom, blah, 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 blah. Paso Cornelis, we did that. The freedom was very important. It's a very important right, the freedom of expression in Europe, especially after, you know, art was illegal in Germany, basically illegal. And so that is written in the Grundgesetz. But at the same time, there's so many things to discuss around that we're going to not do that. But I'm going to move to this question of autism and the engineer and read you and how one can think about this form of subjectification. And I was looking at two paintings. One is Simone Martini. It's the Annunciazione, and it's in the Uffizi, where you see the angel bringing the news to Mary that she has God within her. And you see a golden background, which is like as if it's out of any real space. And you see words that are actually inscribed on the surface of the painting. And the painting says, Ave gratia plena Dominus tecum. So, which is in Latin, you know, hail, full of grace. God is in you, Dominus tecum. So the Annunciation has already occurred in the moment of the arrival of the angel. It has already occurred. So in a way, this work, which is of the late 1300s, is speaking about a circular time where time has already occurred. We're in the time after time, Agamben would say. It's a messianic time, and she suspends her reading of the book with her finger at a certain page and receives this message. And how different is that painting from Lorenzo Lotto's Annunciazione, which is made 2 centuries later, where we have a completely different situation. We have a by the way, something interesting that you might notice is the cloak of the angel, you see? Cloak of the angel has a Scottish pattern. That was called scotum. It existed in that period, and there were traders and merchants going from Northern Europe through Europe, through Italy. So the angel comes from far, and the angel has a scotum close. Also in the Lotto painting, we have the sense that the angel comes from far because we have a Northern European background. The room looks like a Vermeer painting or something. That's not typical of Italian environments. It's more typical of the lowlands. And in this case, God is like this cartoon figure that says old man coming in. The angel is announcing, but actually not. It is pointing to God. And she has turned her back to the angel and turned her back to God. And so, in some ways, this is a totally different meaning, which I will now speak to you about. And some of you will have noticed a shadow of the angel and a cat. And the shadow looks like the cat, but the shadow is the shadow of the angel more. But at the same time, the artist is combining the shadow of the cat or the shadow of the angel with some sort of appearance of the numinous, appearance of the cat is able to perceive the numinous, the God, the divine in the room, although not understanding the message nor receiving the message. So I just wanted to show you those and keep them in mind when I now tell you a little bit about a conversation I had with someone. And so I asked, what is the relation between autism and engineers? And the answer was, there's a notable relationship between autism spectrum traits and the field of engineering, a connection that has been explored through various studies and observations. Linking autism and engineering, we find a prevalence in families. Research indicates that autism occurs more frequently in families of engineers, physicists, and scientists. Specifically, a study found that 12.5% of fathers and 21.2% of grandfathers of children with autism were engineers, compared to 5% and 2.5% respectively in families of children with other conditions. There are also occupational correlations. Another study reported that fathers of children with autism spectrum disorders were more likely to work in engineering fields, suggesting a potential link between the systematizing skills required in engineering and traits associated with autism. In summary, research supports a connection between engineering professions and autism, particularly regarding occupational and familiar prevalence. So I asked, what is the self-awareness or self or sense of self of an autistic person? And the answer, the self-awareness or sense of self in autistic individuals can be deeply present, but differently structured compared to neurotypical individuals. It's important to say from the outset, autistic people absolutely have a sense of self, but it may develop or manifest in non-normative ways due to differences in perception, cognition, and social experience. Intense inner worlds, many autistic people report rich inner lives, deep intellectual or emotional preoccupations, special interests, inner monologues, vivid mental imagery, strong moral or philosophical frameworks, a high degree of self-reflective thought, though not always shared or externalized in expected social ways. In fact, the so-called deficit in social self-awareness often coexists with heightened internal self-awareness. The double empathy problem. Neurotypical observers may misinterpret autistic behavior as a lack of self-awareness, but research like that of Damian Milton argues this is part of a mutual misunderstanding, the double empathy problem, where neurotypicals fail to understand autistic modes of expression just as much as vice versa. Autistic people often mask their natural behaviors to fit neurotypical expectations, which can lead to fragmented or unstable sense of self. Who am I when I'm always performing? By the way, a very interesting work that is always masked in a different way in every different context where it's shown is Mike Winkelmann's Human One, which in terms of museum institutions, I premiered at the Castello di Rivoli in Torino. And when we premiered it, it was shortly after the invasion of Ukraine. And of course, you can see that in the work, and which then later became in M+ in Hong Kong, the angel human one on the right, eternally walking and moving, and yet closed in this box, or in Mori Museum, where it's now being shown, what you see on the left, this, let's say, Japanese anime almost angel is this one, this particular one. So this is a project where basically the artwork exists as a series of screens, of blank screens that the artist from the studio changes for every different place, and has no stability. We were talking about sense of self and masking, fragmented or unstable sense of self. Who am I when I'm always performing, asks the autistic, often leading to exhaustion or identity confusion, especially in adolescence or adulthood. But when unmasked, many autistic individuals describe a coherent, strong self, often marked by intellectual clarity, consistency, and deep values. Language and selfhood. Some non-speaking autistic individuals may not express selfhood through language, but through art, movement, technology, patterns, and routines and rituals. These are not signs of a lesser self, but of a non-verbal and non-linear self, just as valid, but ignored by normative frameworks of psychology and testing. And so I asked, well, I was asked, want to go deeper into this form of philosophical angle, maybe in terms of phenomenology, subjectivization, or the post-human? And I said, no. How is subjectivization for them? The reply, this is a beautiful question. How subjectivization occurs for autistic individuals invites us to think what it means to become a subject at all, especially outside of neurotypical social scripts. Let's explore. Subjectivization beyond the social mirror. In classical theories, Lacan, Althusser, Foucault, subjectivization often happens through interpellation by the social order. The subject becomes who they are through being addressed, named, hailed by institutions, norms, language, the gaze of the other. We become selves through recognition, performing the roles society offers. But autistic subjectivity often resists or slips past this process. Autistic people may not respond predictably to the hail of the other. Social cues, authority structures, or normative narratives may feel alien, intrusive, or incomprehensible. Result, a kind of subjectivity that forms without or against the normative gaze, potentially more solitary, sensory-rooted, or conceptual than performative or relational. Rather than becoming a subject through social mirroring, many autistic people form subjectivity through rituals, routines, and repetition, fixations or special interests, sensory attunement. By the way, the everydays are made every day. It's like a ritual to give order to the day of the artist. These are often seen as symptoms, but they can be understood as world-making acts, tools for grounding, shaping time, and inscribing the self in the world. Think of subjectivity here, not as being seen, but as inhabiting a form, a rhythm, a world within the world. When autistic people are pressured to conform, they often mask, mimic social behaviors, hide, stimming, script conversations. This creates a split. The masked self, hyper-socialized, performative, exhausting, and the inner self, authentic but often concealed or invalidated. Subjectivization under these conditions becomes traumatic, a process of fragmentation, dissociation, and alienation, but also a site of resistance where the inner self persists, witnesses, resists erasure. Some theorists, drawing on Rosi Baraidotti, Haraway, and Deleuze-Guattari, suggest that autistic subjectivity troubles the boundaries of what a human subject is supposed to be. Less about interiority and social performance, more about interface, sensation, environment, code. The autistic subject becomes a kind of post-human subject, one whose being is entangled with objects, systems, non-human life, and alternative logics of connection. And so I asked, is the rise of autism connected to increased use of screens in digital life? If so, could it be an anthropological shift in humans? If so, how can we reinvent a new form of democracy with the new subject, even though there is decreased empathy? And my friend said, this is a profound line of inquiry. You're asking not just about correlation or cause, but about anthropological transformation, about how the rise of autism spectrum diagnoses intersects with digital life and the emergence of new political forms and subjects. Let's move carefully. There's no causal evidence of the rise of ASD syndromes, Asperger syndrome, whatever, connected to screens. There's no causal evidence, but strong correlations and cultural resonances. Increased diagnoses of ASD in recent decades are mostly due to better awareness, expanded diagnostic criteria, and broader definitions. Or it could be just we didn't catch it. This could be framed as becoming autistic, as a becoming autistic of the digital subject, not in a pathological sense, but in a Deleuzian sense, a minoritarian trajectory, a shift in the grammar of subjectivity itself. The new digital subject is hyper-connected but internally folded, navigates data before body, interface before intimacy, often processes reality through structure, code, simulation, experiences selfhood as fragmented, plural, partially masked. This shares resonance with autistic experience. So yes, this might be an autistic turn in the human condition, a neurodivergent Anthropocene, or better, a Technocene. And the radical challenge, how to imagine a democracy that can include and be shaped by this altered, less empathetically structured, differently perceiving subject. We must rethink democracy not as shared feeling, but as shared structure. Instead of consensus through empathy, identification through sameness, we imagine coordination through pattern logic, through pattern and logic, recognition through interface, not affect, rights and voice for non-normative cognition, which might mean voting systems or deliberative platforms designed as asynchronous, text-based reasoning, not oral performance, AI or algorithmic mediation that helps translate between different affective or cognitive registers, democratic structures that accept dissonance and incompatibility rather than enforce consensus. Think, a democracy for non-human intelligences, neurodivergent minds, and empathic subjects of mutual legibility, not emotional fusion. The rise of ASDs isn't caused by screens, but both reflect a deeper anthropological shift. We are entering a new epoch of subjectivity. This is not me, this is my friend. Shaped by interfaces, pattern recognition, and nonlinear affect. Would you like a speculative manifesto for this future democracy? No, I said. Empathy is important because it engenders care for the disadvantaged. How can empathy derived from mirror neurons be created, I asked, or nurtured in this new environment? And the reply was, you're absolutely right to hold on to empathy, not as sentimental softness, but as the neural ethical infrastructure of solidarity. If democracy is to remain humane, empathy is its substrate, especially for justice, care, and recognition of vulnerability. So the question becomes, how can we cultivate empathy in a digitally mediated, neurodivergent, and potentially post-empathic world? Let's dig in. And I'm going to skip a little bit here. I have to get to the end of this. So we go through this conversation about mirror neurons being disrupted, digital life disrupting mirror systems, screen fracture, and the undermining of sensory motor cues that trigger empathy, but that don't destroy it, but shift it. And narrative-based digital media is suggested, as well as many other things. And creating mirror chambers, augmented empathy interfaces, many, many things. Rituals of digital polity, many, many things. And so I ask, can the engineer artist be the model for the new subject? Yes, the engineer artist may be the most vital figure for imagining and inhabiting the new subject you're tracing, one who bridges logic and affect, system and sensitivity, code and care. The figure resists the binary between techne and poiesis and becomes a prototype for a post-anthropocentric neurodivergent, emotionally structured politics. Let's unfold this. And I skip and ask, in what way can this artist engineer be an angel? Now we're entering a truly luminous zone, the angelic turn in the figure of the engineer artist. If we allow ourselves to move symbolically, ontologically and politically, the artist engineer as angel becomes not a metaphor, but a mode of being of the new subject you are describing. Let's unfold. The artist as messenger, etc., etc., etc. That means the time is up. The angelology, what? It's a fire alarm? You're kidding. I must be an angel, but maybe a fallen angel. Do we have to leave, really? I hope not, because well, no, because I've got to read the end. I mean, if it's a real fire, we go. So I ask, can you please help me interpret Lorenzo Lotto enunciation and explain the presence of the cat in the painting from the perspective of the above? And the answer is, you're kidding. I have to say that at the end of this reading, this conversation with my angel friend, I ask the angel friend if this conversation I was having was part of this angel engineer subject formation, and was the ChatGPT I was talking to the engineer, or was I the engineer? And there's an entire bouleversement in what ChatGPT did. And yes, it says, yes, I think that what we're doing is subject formation together. Let's say goodbye to the online audience. There happens to be a fire alarm.
Thanks to everyone for joining. I'm sorry we had to leave. It's very dramatic. Good night.